get started.
Hey, everybody. I'm Will Isaacs. I work at Surgical Care Affiliates, which has a local development shop. And we've been getting into Azure lately, a lot of the functionality that it offers. And so we solved some of our problems recently, and I wanted to share sort of a meta-analysis of how we did that. And may as well use Twitter as a data source here to, there's plenty of data out on Twitter to use as an example. So if you saw on my Twitter feed, I went ahead and posted that the demo site is up and available for today. And essentially what we're doing is taking tweets from Twitter containing C# and .NET as a hashtag. We're putting that into a service bus topic, and then we're consuming that using an Azure Web job. And the Azure Web job can have multiple sort of endpoints that we're focusing on, one of which is a database that we want to update with these tweets that I've pulled. And the other is SignalR here is actually being used to update the client page real time. So as soon as a message comes in on the service bus, we're using SignalR to send that out to any client that has this page open. To get started, let's go ahead and get into some code. In my solution here, you can see that I have 4 sort of projects that make all of this happen. I have a database consumer, a producer web job, a SignalR consumer, and the tech talk feed itself, which is what houses the website and the SignalR and all the API controllers. Excuse me. So let's go ahead and take a look at the producer web job. This is where we're grabbing information from Twitter and putting it onto the service bus. Now this is being ran as an Azure web job right now. That's why the data is being updated on that page. But essentially, if you're unfamiliar with Azure web jobs, you can have them set up as similar to a console application as you want. And they can be ran very simply. It's a great way to get code out there running continuously. And that's why you see that I start off this section with a while true statement. We get a service bus client from my connection strings in the app config. I set the search terms. I created a little command object here that will execute using those. And I brought in a library. I think it's tweet envy is a C# library that you can use aid yourself in querying Twitter. But we searched the tweets using those search terms. I also want to make sure that they've only been submitted in the last 15 seconds. I don't want the same things over and over and over and pulling that. And then from there, I select that into a list of tweets with a sort of custom POCO here that I use to represent tweets throughout the SignalR consumer, the database consumer, all that follow the same format. And once we're done executing that, I go ahead and create a list of tasks where each task is to add a message to the topic inside of Azure Service Bus. Finally, I wait for all of that to complete, and I say the tweets have been added to the service bus. Let's take a look at this add message topic. As simple as it gets with having a service bus client on hand, formatting things in JSON and just posting it to the bus is all it's doing. It's very simple and straightforward. And so that's how we see when I go into my topic subscription here. As long as the Wi-Fi doesn't cut out.
Not really a talk, it's meant to break.
Yeah, there is no internet connection. We've been lied to. What's it? Nah, it's been falling in and out for a second. And this keeps popping up. Close anything that might be interfering here. So I had published that consumer out on the internet Friday afternoon and then tweeted about it. Earlier when we checked it, I think it was like up to 650,000 messages or so that it had pulled down from Twitter, which only consumed about 300 megabytes of space in the service bus itself, which is really small for that amount of messages. Okay. Oh. Yeah, its feelings got hurt from that, Dale. No, disconnected again. Okay. I just set up the hotspot. What was the name of your hotspot? You don't want me to read the password out loud? Okay. Here's to hoping. So real quick, while we're waiting on technology to work, how many people use Azure in here? A couple. Have you guys used web jobs and the service bus before? So the great part about web jobs, at least in my opinion, is that it attaches to an app service. So essentially you can have a web app just like the Twitter feed out there, and it becomes associated with that application that you've deployed. And so it becomes really easy to say, hey, did we have that web job that updated the thing? Oh yeah, it's associated, it's right there. It's easy to get to, and I'll show you guys that in a second. Yeah, just for anybody that didn't hear them or people online, it uses the same configuration as the underlying website that it's associated with, which is very nice from time to time if you want to have one connection string or not.
Do you debug them locally just the same?
Yeah, yeah. If I execute, and I can do that real quick in a second.
Connect to the Azure cluster databases and everything.
Yes. Yeah, I'm even when debugging locally, I'm still putting it out on the same message bus, and you know, at that point, oh, is it fighting over connections? I did. I hope I'm not going to get billed for it, but okay, great. So here we see I have a a topic called content aggregator, and in that I have 2 subscriptions, one being the Signal R. Let's see if I can zoom this up some, which is currently wiping out messages as fast as they come in. And the other one, like I said, database is up to 691,000 messages running since Friday. That's just what's gone through it. But as you can see, I'm well under the max size limit, even with having that many messages queued and ready to go. To go over what it's like to debug an Azure Web job, as you can see, this one is literally just a main method. There's nothing special about the syntax or anything when I execute it. And set a breakpoint somewhere. See if that's the demo talking. So we can see it's executing the search terms. Did you block Twitter on your phone? Huh, well that's quite interesting. Let's go ahead and look at the next one and hope that that's not broken too. So the database consumer is also an Azure Web job. I don't have it currently running, that's why the messages have built up in the queue. The configuration for it is a little bit more involved than simply just having a console application, and so we'll go over that real quickly. The job host configuration is basically for Azure Web jobs, and in here you can specify a dashboard and a storage connection. The reason why you want to do that is so that when you're inside of Azure, if you want to know how your jobs are running, you can set up that storage connection so that anything that's sort of written to the console or logged in another way is then accessible later. So you can figure out why your job failed, or how fast things are going if you build in metrics or other niceties like that. The dashboard itself is merely just where you navigate and see jobs are running. And here we have a service bus configuration. Once again, I'm pulling the Azure Service Bus connection from my app config, and then I'm also specifying max concurrent calls. And that's it's an important part to Azure Web Jobs, is they can be multi-threaded in that fashion, that you can have multiple instances of the Azure Web Job running at the same time. For database consumption, for instance, I could spin up 10 or 20 or however many I want to tear through those messages as fast as I need them to. And let's hope that this one works. So essentially the first line states it found the following functions, this process queue message. And if I go into my functions file, the method signature is what it's detecting here. It's expecting an annotation here, such as service bus trigger or queue trigger or other things like that, to know this is a Azure web job trigger. And so it's merely expecting the name of the topic, which is Twitter posts, and the subscription name, which is database. Then it passes in a message, which is the content of the actual message that's been put on the queue. And I have the log here for writing out to a storage container in Azure, like I talked about. So I initialize a new JSON serializer. Okay. We're going to try going back to Starspace and see. but in this function, I have this annotation laid out of what the subscription is and the topic name. We want to simply deserialize the message. I want to check to make sure that the ID is valid. If it doesn't have an ID on it that's generated by Twitter, I really don't want to deal with that message. I instantiate a new EF context. I search to find the tweet. If it exists, or if it doesn't exist, I go ahead and add it to the context. If it does exist, I update the information, and then I save the changes. That's all well and good. Pretty straightforward of what you would expect to see there. Let's see if it'll run. And it keeps dropping connection. Let me try my phone. No, this is all going straight through Azure, so it's not connected to any of that. All right. Let's see if the second hotspot works. Okay, it's found the process queue message, and now it's begun spitting out information to the screen. So it's logging just like a regular console application at this point. All right. I just check and make sure that the, oh.
You have to whitelist the whole connection?
For the database, I do. That's what it was. I had whitelisted the star space one, but whitelisting is pretty easy to do, thankfully. You can go and set the server firewall and add the client IP, so that way it's only accessible through that IP address. And I'll wipe that out when I'm done. Let's give it another shot. Here's to hope. All right, so now it's begun processing these messages, and like I said earlier, you can have multiple concurrent calls going on at one time. This one call at a time is not very fast. If we had to get through all, however, 900,000 messages at this point, that would be very difficult to get caught up to. So if I bump this up and increase it to 10, let's just give it a trial run and see how fast it appears to process this information. Over a mobile connection. And you can see it begins queuing up multiple triggers there, and each one executes in their own and continues chewing through the messages on the queue. So just for fun, let's bump it up to 100. Let's deploy it, and let's see how fast or how far it gets through by the end of the presentation. Well, this time it'll be running on Azure, thankfully, and not on my machine. Once I publish it up to Azure Web Jobs, it'll begin running in an instance there under my app service plan. I'd have to ask the company I work for. Yeah, I haven't spent a lot. With MSDN licenses, I think you get like $150 credit per month. So for prototyping. Yeah, I don't think it's going to be too bad. The service bus rates are very reasonable. Like I think you get several million messages a month for like $15. So that's pretty incredible of how much data you can push through there.
Do they have a free tier like AWS or?
I'm not sure on the service bus part. I think it may be the entry level is 15. Okay. So now we've published that, and let me just make sure that it's actually out there and running correctly. And as I said, with the Azure Web Jobs, they're associated to my Tech Talk feed app plan here. It may have deployed it in a different one. Let me redeploy it. So here I can go through and target any of the apps, services that I have set up, the subscription, and publish it under Tech Talk feed. So the reason we started going down this path at my company was essentially we had two applications that needed to work together in concert so that they could share data back and forth. And we wanted to make it so that we have less reliance on each application getting a new ETL built for it specifically. So if we need to pull in data, if we create that data in such a way everyone's able to consume it, then we only have to create that process once, and everyone can have their own subscription and pull in their information for their own application. Instead of, okay, we have a new application, let's go ahead and do a dump of this database and these columns and these databases. You can merely just get on the subscription or add a subscription, begin receiving messages, and then maybe do an initial load if you need to for that data. Okay, it's not showing up. So the part about the applications talking to each other is why I included SignalR in this demo. If a bit of information got updated in one of the applications that is visible in the other application, we wanted to send that message over so that the databases would be in sync eventually, but we also wanted to refresh the page that the user was on if they were looking at that particular bit of information. And so with the SignalR being a consumer, we're able to do that, where it can update, or it can have its own message letting a user refresh that page automatically instead of them working with stale data. So once again, this Azure Web job has the same sort of setup. I give it a connection string, I tell it how many max concurrent calls, and I tell it to use that config. In the actual code here, I'm using a REST client basically to call into a controller action I have on my website. And that controller action will then use SignalR to update all the clients with that message that it received. So very simple, we receive that message from the message bus, we log it, we call the REST API, and then that's essentially it. If the status code is not no content, because I know what the response is going to be, or the response is null, we just we abandon the message. And I haven't really talked about that much, but with the message bus, you can have this automatically complete a message when this function ends, and that'll remove it from the topic. If you throw an exception, it will place that message back into the topic, and so it can be reprocessed. So this way, it's very simple. It's always going to get through sometime, or it's going to dead letter eventually if you fail too many times or it takes too long to process. I think the default for time-based dead lettering is like 14 days. So you have 14 days to consume a message or it goes to dead letter. So over there, you can see it's in action, obviously. It's calling this over and over and over again, pulling messages off that bus. And if we look at the subscription, you know, it's keeping that number very down with, or down near zero with only having 10 concurrent instances. No, now it's up to 60. Mm-hmm. So he said it's nice to go in there and to be able to resend a message, or otherwise, you know, look at how it's being processed inside of that Azure Web job if necessary. And then finally, we'll talk about the website itself. As you can see from this, it's the default, you know, MVC application, but I've only added a controller. I've added 2 controllers technically. I've added a SignalR hub. And this just extends hub, which is a SignalR class, and this is where you configure the hub, and this is also used in the part of the generation for the client-side JavaScript that allows you to talk to the hub or send messages back and forth. So not a lot there. Simply a class that defines hub. In my global, you'll see that I register SignalR, or actually I think I have a dedicated startup class to register SignalR. So map SignalR, very simple configuration. And then in the messaging controller itself, one second. So once again, we're using that tweet object. It'd be in a JSON format being passed into this API. We use the global host to get the hub context that I just showed you, and we just tell it to send all the clients that object. And on the client-side code itself, actually it should be in the view. Simply an inline script that registers the connection when we receive a send I want to go ahead and just append using jQuery these tweet IDs, the usernames, the message, formatting the URL to the post, and also go ahead and scroll to the end of the page so that it's always looking like it's on the latest message. So as you can see, when we restart the website, it only gets new SignalR messages. It does not receive old ones and things like that. If I wanted, I could have the database job set up and pull more recent ones. But for the most part, that is how we got our applications talking to one another, using Service Bus to send a message to the other application, this bit of data has been updated, and then internally handling a SignalR communication with the clients so that they're refreshed with data. Is there any questions you guys had on Azure Web Jobs or anything that I can do without an internet connection? Yeah. Yeah. So for instance, the producer one, like we showed earlier, there was it was just a main method that was being executed over and over and over again. The actual configuration of that web job is just merely set up to be continuous here. And if you look at the properties, it's actually just a zip up file of the binary output from a build that I've uploaded effectively. And so you can do that with binary files. You can do it with some other languages. I'm not sure everything it supports, but that allows you to execute it that way. The SignalR consumer, for instance, actually does have that specific process queue message annotation. It's still a console application behind the scenes, but it does have that specific I want to trigger on service bus topics. And so that's it's still running like a console application, but it's a specified trigger that it knows how to interact with inside of Azure.
So why didn't you trigger
If I didn't look at Twitter's API long enough to find out whether they had some way I could do that, but it merely seemed simpler to query every 15 seconds and just take the results. Oh, it is. The SignalR one is, yeah. Yeah, it's for it to have those triggers work effectively, you want it as continuous because it'll keep the console application in memory and running, but that trigger is a method hook for it to call into.
The one that we have was developed by third party vendor.
Mm-hmm.
Back over, but they created this trigger. So every time a message comes up, it fires it out, processes it.
Interesting. I know that, so he was saying that it was triggered as defined in sort of the Azure portal here. I know the APIs and stuff change quite frequently, so maybe I'm out of date on that one. Maybe you can set it up as a triggered. Some of the traditional trigger web jobs look more like you can have a cron schedule, if you're familiar with cron expressions. You can have a manual trigger by basically calling a URL. So that way you can say, go ahead and trigger this. But I'd be interested to hear more about how they managed to have a trigger Azure Web job like that.
Okay, so walk me through how it gets from consuming a tweet to showing it on the page. Because I know I talked to the service bus and it consumes the service bus, puts it in the database and gets the SignalR. It's kind of weird, isn't it?
Okay, so what's the path for retrieving the tweet from the database or from Twitter and then putting it on the bus and then how it's consumed by SignalR? Yeah, so the producer web job here is running every 15 seconds and querying those tweets. So it's running continuously. It's generating those messages, and that's being put on the bus. And then the consumer, or the SignalR consumer, is running continuously. When it sees a new message on the bus, it gets triggered, and the SignalR consumer then calls my website's API saying this has been updated. And in that API call method, as when it grabs into the Signal R hub and broadcasts that message to all the clients.
Okay, so the demo would have been very smooth. You would have also had a database consumer on a separate subscription that would pull and put it into the database.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and if you wanted to, you could even set those up as sort of a serial action. Like maybe we don't want to alert the Signal R client until the database transaction has been committed. So maybe you set up a new subscription after that that says data updated that only talks between the database consumer and the Signal R consumer, so that they're not refreshing on a page and just getting the same result back because maybe the database one hasn't processed it yet, or things like that. So you can kind of set up a whole workflow, or you could try to contain it in the same one, but then you get into the weird, I wrote it to the database, but I didn't, the Signal R call wasn't successful, what do I do?
So by default, the consumers there can be several for a single bus.
Mm-hmm.
Like a multipass.
Yeah, so for the topic specifically, you know, the order is not guaranteed, and you can set up as many subscriptions as you want. With a queue inside of it, it is wanting to do first in, first out. And so if you were having to do a database lookup and a bit of data didn't exist in a topic, you would just put it back on the queue. Maybe you'll try it. There's an Azure default retry policy that'll incrementally step that up. And so it'll keep trying it throughout that period, and maybe that data lookup finally gets written to the database and it's able to successfully complete.
Did you guys happen to like compare and contrast other services and choose this one, or it was just kind of the de-facto ones that Microsoft used to do?
Yeah, it was mostly we were already into Azure and other spaces, just app services and VPNs and stuff like that, and so it made sense to expand in that direction and see what we could get done with Azure Web Jobs in particular. I don't know about everybody else's experience, but when we had a new application, it would be setting up 4 to 6 ETL processes for each new application, because we need data from PeopleSoft, or we need data from this system, and all these things. That this has made it a lot easier, a lot more uniform and reusable code.
So I have a question. So you're grabbing the data and calling another API.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have other examples of other systems you can call, or other Azure services you can plug that into?
You could, like the Azure Functions, is that? Yeah, I haven't done too much with the Azure Functions, but I know that's an option there, that you could pipe that directly into a function without having to have a web job set up. Kind of just like a snippet of code that has a given input and given output, and you write that snippet, yeah. And it has, is it a unique URL that, yeah, I think it's almost just like a controller action, but you don't have to define all the underlying stuff, you just define the actual action itself.
Okay. So Azure Functions actually has like a trigger recommendation easily.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on with the Azure Function stuff. I just haven't gotten to look at that yet, but it seems like it would be a good way to handle this as well. Some of our Azure Web Jobs have a lot more involved processing and looking up and doing other stuff that I don't know would fit for a function, but I think if it's this simple, as my example was, it's probably a great fit for Azure Functions. Any other questions? Well, if not, I think Kimberly had some announcements and other stuff, so.